another golden age of comedy. I'm your host, Bruce Starr, and I have just had the best time hosting this show, putting this show together. It has enabled me to reconnect with some some of my greatest joys in my life, and that was being able to be a part, just happened to be a part of the 80s golden age of comedy, especially out at the Melrose Improv in Los Angeles in the early 80s. And one of the guys that I had just, I felt a kinship with, a real friendship with, just a real personable guy, an accomplished guy, is Paul Provenza. There he is. There's Paul. And I'm so glad that you've come on the show, Paul, because I think just us talking about what life was like back in the 80s at the Improv and on the road and in Hollywood will be so interesting to people watching this interview.
Well, that remains to be seen, Bruce.
So tell me, Paul.
Yes, sir.
Tell me about young Paul. Was young Paul at all affected by family life? How did Paul get from being the young Paul to getting into or having an interest in show business?
Well, I actually was interested in stand-up per se, that very particular form, at a very young age, like 7 or 8.
Wow.
And I think the reason that came about is manyfold. First of all, I came from a big Italian family. My family was small. It was my dad, my mother, myself, and my sister. But all the cousins, my grandmother, all the aunts and uncles, all lived in the same building, like on a three-story private house. We see each other all the time. So I had this really big Italian family, and we'd sit around and we watched the Ed Sullivan Show because she loved Ed Sullivan. You didn't have to know English, which she claimed to never have learned, although I think she was lying about that. But so you didn't need the English. You could see opera singers, jugglers, you could see Chinese acrobats, you could see, Tony Bennett. But of course, there was always a stand-up comedian. And from a really young age, I remember zeroing in on the stand-up comedians going, wow, man, that's an interesting thing. It's just one person standing there talking. And I think, my dad was really severe. And he was, kind of the children should be seen, not heard kind of school of discipline. And I was always really annoying as a kid, always asking questions and always making noise about something. And I was always being to shut up or just, stop being annoying. And I think this is me in retrospect, psychologizing it, but I think I would look back and I would say, there's a person just standing there with everybody hanging on their very word. They're not only are they not being told to shut up, but people are paying money and enjoying just sitting and listening to one person's thing. And I think that stuck with me. And then I also had, I had amblyopia, commonly known as lazy eye. I had surgery on my eyes when I was about 8 or 9. And one eye used to cross in all the time. And I had to do all these eye exercises and things after the surgery for years and years and years. And when I was a real little kid, I had glasses from about the age of 3. And because I had amblyopia or lazy eye, my 3-dimensional vision was compromised. So all my 3-dimensional vision was kind of learned. Like I would know that this cup is slightly behind this cup just from experience, but I couldn't really see it, So as a result, I was always falling down and tripping and bumping into the things. And, I would turn a corner and I'd bang my glasses on the corner because my depth perception was off. And I would break my glasses and my parents would get mad at me and say, well, that's, your fault for not being careful. And so for another year until my mother's teacher UFT insurance paid for another pair of glasses, I would have a big hunk of Scotch tape on one corner of my glasses all the time. And it was just like the bane of my existence. And I would get yelled at for falling down and tripping and knocking things over. And then I would see Jerry Lewis, who was doing exactly what I was getting in trouble for, was a big star and people loved him, including myself. And I actually became like a huge Jerry Lewis fan because I could relate to, what seems to be a mentally disabled person, so that was my first real connection to comedy was oh my God. So I started, I kind of, without realizing this is what was happening, I sort of started to say, well, okay, so if I fall down or I bump into something or I do something that I'm careless or I'm going to get in trouble for, I'm going to try and make it funny, and that'll make it okay. And that's really how I, developed internally.
So it's great to hear that you. It's great to hear that you were funny when you were a kid, and I love that. I love that. But that doesn't necessarily translate into getting up on stage or getting in front of people. Tell me about that next step for you, because that's for me. That's the most important, most interesting part.
Yeah, well, obviously, I gathered an interest in comedy from that very early age, and stayed interested in it. And I had an older cousin, my cousin Bob, who was really like a second father to me. My dad died when I was about 17,
Oh,
and Bob was like a second dad to me. And he loved laughing, and we started, going down the roads of Woody Allen movies and Marx Brothers movies. Back in the early 70s, they used to have these all night Marx Brothers marathons at the Thalia, and Woody Allen marathons and things. And he would take me to all of those. And then I started actually going to the Improv as a patron, because back then they didn't really check IDs. So I was like 15 years old, sitting there drinking, tequila sunrises with my cousin or maybe a couple of friends or something. But so I was really consumed by comedy and consuming loads of comedy. And the reason I found the Improv was because I'd be watching, Freddie Prinze or Robert Klein or any number of young comics at the time on the Tonight Show, or Murph Griffin or Mike Douglas. And they would always say, so where'd you get your start? And 9 times out of 10, people would say, at the Improv in New York on 44th Street. And so I was like, well, that seems to be the place to go to get a start as a comedian. So I went to the phone book. I don't know if you remember those. Uh, and I looked up the Improvisation on 44th Street, and I called them and I said, I would like to become a comedian. How do I do that? and they said, well, you come down, you wait online, you pick a number, and you audition. It's like an open mic thing. And they explained it all to me. And I started going and waiting on lines. And I got there, like, I lived in the Bronx, so it was kind of a long trek down to Midtown. But I would get there at, like, the earliest I could make it was maybe 10 in the morning. And there was a line like 50 people long already.
oh my God.
And I would just wait on that line. And it used to be where you'd line up, right? I mean, I guess people would start at like 8 in the morning or something, lining up. The place didn't open until like 7 at night, shows start until 8 or something, 9. And you would line up and you would wait and wait and wait until people came and opened the club. And then they would pass around a bucket and you'd get a number. And that would be your place in the lineup. And I remember just waiting there for hours and hours and hours, week after week after week. And then the first, and like I said, I used to go there as a patron. I was so into comedy. I mean, I saw when I was a young teen, like literally like 14, 15, I probably was the youngest I was there. But at 15 and 16, I was seeing Elaine Boozler, Larry David, Franken and Davis, Steve Landesberg would pop in, Dangerfield would pop in, Leno. I mean, you name it. All the greats, were there, just doing what I wanted to do. They weren't that much further ahead of me, and I was just blown away by the amount of funny that I never heard of before. I would just be like, this is unbelievable. Emily Levine, just the list went on and on. And funnily enough, Gilbert Gottfried was already doing stand-up then. He started when he was like 15, and he's 100 now. Anyway, yeah, I mean, they put Larry David on late at night to clear the room. They put Gilbert on late to clear the room too, because he was so out there. Anyway,
Was Charlie in Manhattan?
Who? Charlie who?
Fleischer?
No. I didn't meet him until 1980 when I moved to Los Angeles. He actually was in. I got a pilot, which is actually what took me to L.A. And Charles Fleischer was in that pilot. So my first connection with Charles Fleischer was a rather, close one because we were working together on this thing that both of us knew wasn't really that funny. But anyway, so I remember. I will tell you this: my first time on stage, I had gotten a number that was really, really high, and I wasn't going to go on for quite some time. And at around 3 o'clock in the morning, because the place stay open until 4 a.m., which is legal curfew, or the last patron left, whichever came first. And it was usually 4 a.m. because there was always a hooker or a pimp in the back trying to get out of the cold in the winter. There were always a couple of people drunk in the room, and they would keep the place open to sell 2 more drinks at any point. So it was about 3:30 in the morning. And so I went up to the MC and I said, listen, my number's not for a few. I still got a few more to go, but I'm wondering if maybe you could slip me up a little bit earlier because I have to be in school in 4 hours. And he cracked up. He thought that was hilarious. And he brought me right up on stage next. And I did horrible. But I knew it's where I wanted to be. I remember standing there, getting no laughs, seeing that light, that Super Trooper in the back of the room, bright as hell, like a train coming at you, and the vibe of the place. I remember it. I can actually feel it as I'm describing it to you. And I didn't get a single laugh through the whole thing, but I knew I was coming back. And the great part about that story is that many years later on the Tonight Show, I got to tell Jay that story because he was the MC that night.
Oh!
That was kind of a beautiful, poetic that was nice.
Sometimes I hear from some of the comedians that, when you're standing on that line with some funny people, you establish relationships that you might even have to this day.
Steve Middleman and I met on that line.
Oh!
Yeah, I'm still I haven't seen Steve in a while, but we still consider each other really close friends. I don't know if you remember Brant Van Hoffman.
Yeah, sure.
And not quite that early, but like a year later, it's where I met Keenan Wayans.
Yeah, sure.
Yeah, loads of people. Yeah, those connections, they stick with you because you're both in that moment of like, this could be where we decide what our lives are, and you're both going through it at the same time. So yeah. Not long after that, I met Kathy Ladman and Sue Kolinsky, and we're still all friends to this day.
So tell me about that first 5 minutes, because that's really a bear. You've got to go from thinking that you're funny to being able to make a room full of people laugh, and that's not.
Well, here's the thing: is that I remember this too. It was such a moment in my life, but I remember not knowing whether or not I was going to go up and do some jokes I had written, or I was going to go up and tell a story that I had written. Because I was a fan of, the old jokesters. I would watch Pat Cooper and Shecky Green and Fat Jack Leonard and Jackie Mason and Joey Bishop. And I would watch the Starkers, the old school cats. And I was like, okay, so I gravitated towards that kind of joke act. But then I was also in love with Woody Allen, and the Moose Mingles was like, to me, that's like great literature in terms of comedy, and these kind of stories, and I was also watching sort of counterculture comedy coming in, and so these ideas of telling stories that went someplace also appealed to me. So I didn't know what I wanted to do. So I had made the choice because it was so late at night and there were so few people left in the audience. And I thought, well, I probably can't get laugh after laugh after laugh. So I'm going to tell the story and bank it all on a couple of laughs through the story. And that was a choice that I made that turned out to not be so great. Or so I thought. It was my first time on stage. How could I judge if it was a good idea or a bad idea, right? But after that, I said, okay, I'm going to go for the jokes, and I'm going to see if I can make ideas that I have funny, and kind of, less Woody Allen and more of the vast majority of comedians that I knew. And that's when
funny story about Sue Kalinsky that she told the other day. You have to watch her interview. She said she did her first 5 minutes and she did really well. And they asked her back. And not knowing anything, there's nobody to teach you. There's no
yeah,
teacher. She
yeah,
thought she had to come up with another 5 new minutes.
right, yeah. See, that's the thing, is that when you were a young comic starting out back then, I think it's different now because there's a whole world of podcasts and interest in comedy, and there's a whole sort of world of critiquing comedy in a kind of literate way that didn't exist back then. And really, the only way you could learn it is by doing it and just by going by gut. Uh, yeah, we figured everything out on the fly. And so, like Sue, when I went back my next time and I started doing stuff that was less like Woody Allen and more like what I was ultimately to become, it started clicking. And I also, everybody comes to the table with different assets and liabilities. And my particular asset, like, it took many years for my writing to catch up with my performing. I was a really good performer. I had a lot of presence, and I had a natural flair for acting. And after watching Robert Klein and George Carlin and seeing them take, in the middle of a bit, they would have a whole character that expressed something, and then back to their own voice. And so I started to do all that kind of stuff. And that ended up being something that worked in my favor, that I was a really good performer. Even though I still had tremendous amounts to learn, I kind of came to the table with a little bit of flair for performance. And that carried me a lot. And it was many, many years before I felt like, I really devoted myself to, this needs to be smarter, or I could do better than this,
I was going to ask you, how long did it take? Because you know what, the new comedians, the up and coming comedians, maybe they think they can get up at some mic nights and be ready in 6 months or a year. When did you start feeling comfortable?
I felt comfortable performing pretty early on. But then what happened in my case, which I think happens for a lot of people, not everybody, again, everybody's journey is different. But for me, what happened was I started, because my appreciation for comedy never waned, and I kept learning more and more and exploring more and more, discovering more and more of other people's work. I came to realize that I needed to push myself. I realized that one of my strengths was performing, and I was selling a lot of stuff, that the stuff wasn't as good as the response I was getting. Do you know what I mean?
Yeah.
And I started to think, like, the problem is, I started to feel like the last kid to fall asleep at a slumber party. Everybody's tired, everybody wants to go to sleep, but this one guy just making a lot of noise,
Wow.
And I started to feel like I need something else. So I really devoted myself towards the writing more, and to figure out how to be more real and figure out what my perspectives were, and why is this funny as opposed to this, and in terms of, like, I don't really believe this joke, or this joke is funny but it's kind of hacky, or it's obvious, or whatever. And I just started to really develop my writing more. And so it wasn't until now this period where I'm talking about auditioning, we're talking about the mid 70s.
Yeah.
Because I graduated from high school in 75, and I was going to the University of Pennsylvania in Philadelphia, and driving up to New York to do spots at the Improv.
Wow.
So mid 70s here. And it wasn't probably until the mid 80s, at least a decade, before I felt like my performance and my material were kind of growing together.
Wow.
And then for years, I felt great about that. And then I didn't. And I was like, something's wrong. I feel like I'm wearing an ill-fitting suit of clothes. Because as you grow as a human being, as you change, as you have more time on the planet, you outgrow the stuff that worked for you when you were 20. And so it's through all these years, it's been a constant sort of like, okay, I'm cooking. Shit, I don't feel good about any of this. What do I do? How do I get it? What's my next shift? What do I change? What do we? And then, oh, okay, now I'm cooking. Wait a minute, I'm tired of this. Oh, wait, this isn't working right, or this isn't working for me. It doesn't feel right, you know. But I'm particularly sensitive to that kind of stuff. Many people are, but many people aren't, and many people are just happy saying, "I'm up there making people laugh, and I'm happy, and as long as this keeps moving forward, I'm fine," you know. And I don't judge any of that because every person's different. Just like every singer is different, every musician is different, every painter is different, every comic is different, and everybody's journey is different. But so it did take me about 10 years to feel like, oh, I deserve some of the breaks I'm getting and some of the accolades.
Which is only 25. I mean, you know.
Yeah, it wasn't. Yeah, I would say probably by my late 20s is when I started to feel like, oh, I know what I'm doing. But then by my early 30s, I was like, I don't know what I'm doing anymore.
So what was it? Tell me about when you started getting a little bit of outside attention. You're working, and then all of a sudden people are coming at you at the end of the shows. What was that like?
Well, you know, I loved working live. I loved it. But I also had studied acting. For my junior year abroad, I went and studied at the Royal Academy of Dramatic Arts in London.
Wow.
And so I was really steeped in the art of acting and dramatic literature and all that stuff. And so I always felt like that was something else I also wanted to do. And as that was developing, and like I said, I kind of had a natural flair for performing. So it all I kind of felt like, well, these are, they're separate, but they're not. They're actually, there's the same thing, whatever. But anyway, so acting meant something to me. But then I got out of college in '79, and Chris Albrecht was running the Improv. And at the time, he had made a talent development deal with ABC, where they basically paid him a consulting fee to put together a lineup once a month of young comedians,
How cool.
young talent
Wow.
that they should be aware of, right?
Wow.
And actually, it presaged when all of a sudden, like Roseanne they started doing all these sitcoms around comics. And this all presaged that movement where they started just building sitcoms around a comic identity, like Roseanne Barr and Tim Allen and Brett Butler and all those kinds of people that went on to have great success in that. Again, they saw it on the horizon with Gabe Kaplan and Freddie Prinze, but it really didn't hit full swing until well into the early to mid '80s. But so at this point, ABC was looking ahead towards that, and so they were looking at all this young talent. So after I'd been working there about 6 months after I'd gotten out of college, Chris said to me, I'd like to put you on one of these showcases, and they'll put you on tape at ABC. So I was like, okay, great. I didn't expect anything to come of it, but this seems to be a thing that you do as you're moving forward. Great. And I did that. And it wasn't until about 6 months later, I get a phone call out of the blue from a casting director at ABC.
Wow.
Saying, we got your information from, the tape that we made at the Improv of you, whatever. And we shot a pilot in Los Angeles. The network has picked up the pilot, but they want to recast it. And there's already a set. It's a hot set. You will be on it Monday.
Whoa.
You'll be on it Monday morning. Come and audition on Saturday morning. And if you get the part, you fly to LA and you start work on Monday morning.
Oh my God.
So I went in and I did the audition and I got the part.
Whoa.
And said, who's your agent? And I was like, I don't have an agent. So at this point, Chris Albrecht had moved to Los Angeles and started working as an agent at ICM. And before he left, he said to me, at some point, I'd like to bring you out. I think you might be, part of a stable. He said, but you need some more time and the time's not right for me. But if you ever need anything, feel free to call me.
Cool.
So out of the blue, I called him and I said, Chris, you're not going to believe this. He said, but I just got offered a pilot. And I don't know what that, and he went, what? And he told me, and I told him the details of it. And he, looked it up and he said, I got this. He goes, I'm happy to work this out for you. And so he made the deal. And on Monday morning, I was on the hot set of a pilot co-starring Charlie Fleischer, and we did the pilot, and ultimately it didn't get picked up. But Chris at that point said, you know what? You already have a pilot under your belt. You're a young face, young talent that nobody in the business knows yet. This is a perfect time for you to move to LA.
Yeah.
And I had school for about a year at this point, and I just picked up and came to LA. And then Chris and ICM were representing me at that point because I gave them, you know, a reasonable amount of gig right out of the gate.
Right.
And then I was with them for years and years after that. And the next thing that followed was a development deal, actually, with NBC. It was for me and Keenan Wayans together. And that happened was Keenan had moved out to LA as part of the first wave of Chris bringing new talent across to Los Angeles. Keenan was part of that first batch. And there was one night at the Improv that was a showcase for Saturday Night Live. We're talking early 1980.
I was probably there then. It
was actually mid 1980, and they were recasting Saturday Night Live. 1980 was the Gene Domanian year. That's when the whole original cast left, and they brought in a new cast, and that year ended up being a debacle. But it was at that time when they were looking for that cast that they held a showcase at the Improv. And Keenan and I were both on the showcase. And Keenan and I used to do a thing back at the Improv in New York. Whenever one of us was emceeing or we brought the other one up, Keenan would do this to me. He would say like, you know, ladies and gentlemen, Paul Provenza, and he would bring me up and he would stay there and he'd say, Paul, he goes, this is a great crowd. I'd say, it looks great, Keenan. He goes, no, this is a great crowd. I said, I feel it. And you go, are you ready for this crowd? Goes, I'm ready. Oh, I'm ready. Are you sure you can handle this crowd? I'm like, I can handle this. He goes, are you a man? Are you tough enough to handle this crowd? I go, yeah. He goes, are you a man? I go, I'm a man. He goes, shout it, I'm a man. I go, I'm a man. He goes, am I a man? I'm a man. And you go, okay, babe, have a good show. And kiss me on the lips, right? And it was just a hilarious, goofy little thing. See how it would work on an, you know, at the Improv, right?
Wow.
So after the showcase, we find out that, you know, I didn't get Saturday Night Live, Keenan didn't get Saturday Night Live, but the NBC talent department called and said, we want to put those two guys together. And we wanted to develop a show for the two of them. They have a great chemistry. And I ended up with this development deal. And it was such, at the time, this was the kind of deal it was where I couldn't do anything for any other network. So the idea was they would develop a series and they would push me for guest starring roles on other things on NBC. So we had that deal for well over a year. And we went in and we pitched an idea for the show we wanted to do, which was a comedy version. And I know the original was kind of comedy, but more drama. But we wanted to do a comedy version of I Spy, where, I don't know if you remember in the original I Spy, Bill Cosby was a real tennis pro, and Robert Culp was his manager, but they were spies together, right? That was their cover story. Well, in our premise, Keenan was actually a tennis pro, and I was actually his manager, and we were not spies, but all the people that their fathers used to deal with just assumed that this was the same exact ruse and that we were spies. So we would end up in these spy situations, having no idea and no desire on any of it. So that was the original premise. Now, I had done stand-up at the Laugh Stop in Palm Springs. And at one time that I went out there, Robert Culp was in the audience. You know, a lot of stars would spend time in Palm Springs. So I remember getting up one night there at the Palm Springs Laugh Stop, and Don Adams was in the audience. And the audience knew that he was there because somebody had introduced him, right? And at one point in the middle of my set, the phone at the bar rang. And I took my shoe off and went, hello, and it's for you, to Don Adams. And the place went nuts, right? So it was always fun. There were always these weird little kind of big, kind of not big celebrities in the audience. And Robert Culp was there one night. And he remembered me because I reached out to him. And I told him the idea that we were pitching. And I said, would you come on the show? Would you come on the pilot and kind of hand it off to us in some way?
Nice.
And Keenan had been on the Tonight Show one night when Bill Cosby was hosting, and Bill Cosby loved him. And so Keenan got in touch with Bill Cosby and said, would you come and do this? And so Culp and Cosby both said, yeah, we'd love to. We're in, right? So we developed this thing. We worked on scripts. They put us with some writer, and we worked on the thing, the whole thing. And it ended up falling apart because Sheldon Leonard, who owned the rights, wouldn't release the rights. He was going to do something with the idea himself. At the time, he wanted to make a movie, which didn't get made until well into the early 2000s and was awful. But so because Sheldon Leonard wouldn't give us the right to do it, we ended up not being able to do the show that we spent a year on. So that was the first thing that happened after I moved out to LA. And in that year of not being able to do any other acting work, not being able to go out on any auditions other than for, a handful of NBC projects here and there, in that year that I wasn't able to do any other auditions and I couldn't take any other gigs because we were under this development deal, I just worked the road. And the more I did clubs, the more, the response was getting better and better, and I was making a name for myself. And then the comedy boom started to kick in, and more clubs were opening up, and more clubs. And so I ended up, but through most of the 80s, I ended up working maybe 40 weeks a year on the road.
Wow.
And coming back and spending, a couple of months for pilot season, or, you spend 3 weeks in LA to make sure you can get as many auditions as you can in. And then you go on the road for a week and then come back for another week and go back for.
I remember those days.
Yeah. And so that was how it all started to really flower and blossom. And then, like every other comic at the time, I was like, I got to get on the Tonight Show. And Chris Albrecht, Chris was a very stern taskmaster. He was no bullshit. He was like, I remember having a fight with him before he left the New York Improv, and I was just a starter, just coming up, just a real pisher, I remember him saying, I was complaining about not getting stage time, and he was like, cool your jets, man. You just got here. Do you know how long this takes? Cool your jets. Yeah, you have talent. Yeah, you got a lot of possibilities, because the best thing for you right now is not to go on stage as much as you want to go on stage, because you got shit to learn. And my dad had just died, right, when I was 17. So Chris was talking to me at 18, 19. And he became like a father figure to me. And as my agent, he was also very, relax, don't worry. It's not your time for the Tonight Show. Relax. You just keep doing what you're doing. You're just getting better. Just relax. And so I cooled my jets on that, and it was hard because back then the Tonight Show was like, the top of the mountain. And then out of the blue, a weird thing happened. Now, Jim McCauley, who was the person who chose the comics to go on the Tonight Show, he was at the Improv all the time. And, Chris would always say to me, he said, look, it's always better for the Tonight Show to come to you than for you to go to them and beg to be on it. He goes, let them find you.
Good point.
Phenomenal point. Phenomenal. I was too naive to have seen that myself. Anyway, cut to 1983. King of Comedy comes out, the Martin Scorsese film with Jerry Lewis, Robert De Niro, Sandra Bernhard. They have a big premiere in Los Angeles for the movie. The after party is at the Improv.
Oh.
And a lot of people at the premiere and that came to the after party were friends of Jerry's, comedy friends of Jerry's, as well as, film people and movie executives and what have you. Place was packed with all these people partying about this movie that just got released. And Bud Friedman asked me, he goes, I want you to perform at the party. I was like, okay. So I get up there. A few people went up and did sets. And it was horrible because, the old comics, they're all hanging out with each other. They're all making fun of everybody on stage. They're all doing their thing, Yeah, it's what they fucking earned the right. That's what they were doing. So it was just a horrible, horrible gig. But I held my own, and I walked off stage with my head held high. And Jim McCauley walks up to me. He happened to be in the room.
Wow.
And he says to me, I saw what you did there. And I was like, yeah, I'm sorry. And I'm like, I'm not going to get the Tonight Show for another 10 years, And he said, you didn't back down for a second, and you knew what you were doing. And he goes, I respect that. He goes, and I could see through everything and how talented you are. He goes, I'd like you to do the show.
Oh,
Oh my God, I have no idea. And, you know, a week later, I'm in his office and we're going through the material. He's helping me choose my first spot. And that was 1983. So that process was really interesting because, and it's referring, if you have any younger viewers here, it's important to note that the Tonight Show was like, it was really huge. I mean, it was like the equivalent of winning an Oscar for a stand-up, just to be on the show. Even if you just did it once, you won the Oscar, you know, and tremendously legitimizing. And the TV landscape was very different then, and they were much more controlled. You know, now it's a real free for all almost. But at the time, doing the Tonight Show was such a big deal, and they really zeroed in on what you were doing and making sure you didn't say the wrong things and standards and practices issues and all that sort of stuff. But also, Jim felt like he knew how to construct a set that worked on the Tonight Show, and so he would guide you, and he would say, you know, he would come and see you do it in clubs, and he would say, yeah, that bit's a club bit. I don't think it's going to fly on TV the way you think it is. So let's take that one out and rework this set, you know? So they were really invested. Now it's like, you know, you get a show, you show up, you do your thing. Nobody gives a crap, you know? But they were really picky, they really focused on it. I was doing my 6 minutes 2-3 times a night for 2 weeks. And then one day I call up Jim and I go, Jim, I'm really scared. I go, it stopped working. He goes, what are you talking about? He goes, I was there last week and the set was doing great. And I was like, it just stopped working. And he said, that's great. That means it's no longer a nightclub set. It's ready for TV.
oh, wow.
Put me on the Tonight Show and I friggin' destroyed.
Wow.
Destroyed. And at one point, nobody was more shocked than me at this response. In fact, after the show, Ed McMahon came up to me and he said, I haven't seen a first spot that strong since Freddie Prinze.
Wow.
Johnny came into my dressing room after the show.
Oh my God.
Talking how funny I was and giving me tags to use. And for years, I would use them on the road. And if they didn't work, I would say to the audience, Johnny Carson gave me that tag. Fuck you, I'm keeping it. I mean, it was tremendous, right? And I found out afterwards that it was really Jim McCauley's fault because I had a bit that I closed with. Now, keep in mind, this is 1983, okay? Designer jeans were all the rage, right? Late 70s, early 80s, designer jeans. And I was doing this bit about Gloria Vanderbilt, who had her line of designer jeans.
I think I remember this.
And she used to do commercials for her jeans. And she was just this misshapen plastic surgery abomination. And I used to do a bit about her and talk about, you know, why are we taking fashion advice from a woman who's had so many facelifts? If she gets one more, she's going to have a goatee. And the thing about, you know, on one commercial, she had this big, like, sweater with a big flower on it. And I was like, that's where they tied up the extra skin. I just went on about
I remember this.
Vanderbilt, right? Well, Johnny was beside himself. He was laughing so hard at one point, and I saw the audience, and I was looking at the audience, and they're looking at Johnny. And so out of the side of my vision, I look at Johnny, and he is banging the desk, laughing. At one point, he turns around, he spins out of his chair onto his knees and starts banging the platform. The desk is on.
God.
And I'm like, I cannot believe this is happening, right? And I'm looking at the audience, and whether they're laughing just as hard at Johnny, more so at Johnny even than anything I'm saying. So, you know, the old adage, if you're having trouble keeping a straight face or staying with it, look at the band, because the band's seen it all, right? So I look at the band just to try to like, I don't know what's going on there. I don't know what's going on there. Let me get some, you know, grounding. I look at the band. They're in hysterics. The saxophone players banging his saxophone on the plexiglass partition.
God.
And it was like an out-of-body experience. Like, this has nothing to do with me at this point. For some reason, this is way too funny.
Oh my God.
And afterwards, Jim McCauley and Johnny, he didn't call me over to the couch, but he walked over to me on the spot, right? Those are the two things. If he calls you over to the couch, you're set, right? If he does this, fantastic. The in-between is if he comes to you to throw the commercial rather than just sitting at the desk. So he came over and he shook my hand. He goes, very, very funny. And he goes, we'll be right back after this. And when he came to see me after the show, he said, I wanted to bring you to the panel, but the other guest on the show who was following my spot was Art Pepper, the jazz cat, Art Pepper. And he said, Art had been bumped 2 nights previously because the shows ran long and he couldn't stay another day. He had to get to New Orleans to do a gig. So he said, I couldn't bring you on stage. He goes, but I want to have it as soon as possible.
Wow.
And Macaulay came in and he told me something that I didn't know. He had stacked the deck in my favor in a big way. Apparently, Johnny's then current ex-wife, his most recent ex-wife at the time, who took him to the Cleaners, was really close friends with Gloria Vanderbilt. And he hated her. He hated her. He thought she was a see you next Tuesday, and he hated her. So knowing that,
wow,
Macaulay knew that if I close with this bit, I'm going to destroy. And I have nothing but great thanks to Jim Macaulay. A lot of people talk about Jim Macaulay as really kind of sticking his nose in where it doesn't belong and telling people what they should do and shouldn't do and everything. But I got nothing but the greatest things to say about Jim Macaulay. He nailed it for me.
Wow.
Nailed it. So here's where I got to tell you this because this is a life lesson. This is the real life lesson. They asked me to come back on the show the following week. And I said no. I said no. And the reason I said no, what I claimed was, I don't have enough material. I don't have anything to promote. You know, I can't book enough gigs to make it worth my while to go and promote them. I went through this whole litany of pseudo legitimate professional excuses for not doing it again. But what really was I didn't think I could ever come as close to that. And I was scared and I was nervous and I was intimidated. And so I didn't do it. And I think the people at the show were so insulted that it was probably another 3 years or so before I got back. And it's one of the biggest life lessons, not just professional and comedic lessons, but one of the biggest life lessons was, you know, fear will destroy you. Fear will destroy you. The truth is, if I had gone on and done a second spot that was 40% as good, it would have been a killer spot. But I was so intimidated and afraid of my own success that I pussied out, and I paid a price for it. But I learned a huge life lesson.
What a fantastic story. You know, Tom Dreesen, I never had it explained to me, and he did this all on his own, what it was like backstage.
Yeah.
Behind that curtain the first time.
Yeah.
What was it like for you?
Wow, man. Well, first of all, I was wearing a new suit that I just bought, right? So I'm feeling super sharp, and but still, like, you know, this is, and I'm backstage, and I'm, you know, the band is playing through the commercial break, and I know, you know, we're just minutes away from Johnny introducing me, and there's a guy standing there who had been there for 30 years. He was a stagehand whose job it was to part the curtain for you to walk through. And he'd seen it all, and he could tell that I was nervous, and I'm sure he'd seen every comic that ever did the show nervous, you know. And he just put his hand on my shoulder and he said, "You're going to do just fine." He said, "You on the show, somebody thinks you deserve it. You're going to do just fine."
Wow.
And I just took a deep breath. I was like, yeah. And I hear the intro and they open the curtain and I go out to my spot. And from then on, it was an out-of-body experience. But that moment backstage and seeing that curtain, remember that iconic multicolored curtain? That's what he had at the time, you know, and the rigging in the back so that if you pull one side, it opens up, and seeing the whole thing and just going, okay, this is the side of this that I'm on. I'm not watching me do the show. I'm doing the show. This is crazy, right?
And that first joke, the laughter from the first joke.
Yeah, and that was it. It was like, as soon as I got that first laugh, which was exactly where it was supposed to be in my head, a huge sigh of relief. And I actually reminded myself, slow down, sell this, enjoy this, And yeah, Jim McCauley nailed it. He had it right. And it was one of the greatest moments of my life, for sure. And I had flown my cousin Bob, who took me to the Marx Brothers and who was like my comedy, pal. And, we used to write jokes for Rodney Dangerfield together.
Mm.
It wasn't until many years later that I could actually say, hey, Rodney, you want to buy this joke? You want to buy that joke? But we used to do it just because we had fun writing Rodney Dangerfield jokes. And, he flew out to be there in the front row for it. It was real amazing. Yeah, it was pretty cool.
And I'm sure that when you got that development deal is when I got to know you at the Improv, because that's when you had your chance to, you were either on the road or you're at the Improv
Yeah.
every.
Yeah, I was hanging out every night. When I wasn't on the road, I was at the Improv every night. And I would go to the Comedy Store as well. But, there was still that weird tension between them. And also, by the time I got out there in 1980, there had been a bit of an influx of young New York comics. And Mitzi had the attitude of, oh, yeah, we got a lot of straight white guys coming in here now, and so it was a long time before I ever felt like I was comfortable at the comedy store. Well, I never actually really felt comfortable until recently, believe it or not.
Wow.
Comedy Store now is magnificent. Anybody who's fortunate enough to be part of that family right now, it's never been as beautiful as it is right now.
Wow.
It's a real laboratory and an incubator, and they're doing it right. The atmosphere, the vibe there, it's just fantastic. But at the time, in the early 80s, the Comedy Store was evil. It had a horrible vibe. There was coke everywhere, and all that coke anxiety and desperation, and people were mean and nasty and really cliquish about letting new people in, and Mitzi was really, not. She just had seen enough guys like me, I mean, because Reiser, Scheidner, Bolster, myself, Larry Miller. I mean, a whole bunch of us all sort of came out around the same time. And, in fairness, she was right. She was like, wow, I'm getting kind of inundated with the same kind of guy. But that made me feel like, well, the Improv is where I'm going to be spending most of my time. And it wasn't until many, many years later that I kind of got spots at the Improv, at the Comedy Store whenever I called in. But I would call in very infrequently because it wasn't my home.
The Improv really felt like home.
Yeah, it really did. And, they, one of the great things about the Comedy Cellar in New York is that one table in the restaurant upstairs is that one table where all the comics hang, and that's their table, right? And there was one like that at the LA Improv. There wasn't any such thing at the Comedy Store.
No. So was anybody there? I know Jay helped a lot of people. Anybody he could. I don't think he put up a wall to anyone as far as the feedback I'm getting from any of the comedians that have done the show. Who helped you?
Jay is still one of the most generous, kind comedians I've ever known. I mean, he lobbied on my behalf in a number of directions. I mean, when the Tonight Show went to Conan O'Brien, Jay had been pushing for me to do it. I mean, he was always really tremendous to me about it. And we weren't that close. We weren't like, I didn't go hang out at his house. I wasn't somebody that he brought in to help write, material or anything like that. He just treated me with a tremendous amount of respect and appreciation and fondness, and was always very, very generous to me. Pretty much everybody at the Improv was. I mean, people would throw each other gigs all the time. People would say, "You hear about that new club that opened up in Ventura?" And mention your name to the club owner or whatever. And people are constantly, a little bit of that New York, we're all in this together vibe came out here to LA for sure. But the pressures are different because in New York, the odds you getting to the Tonight Show were zero. I mean, one night out of 5 years, maybe Jim McCauley might be in an audience.
Mm-hmm.
In LA, every night you had a shot at getting on the Tonight Show if Jim McCauley was in the audience, you know, and then you had no idea who was, and you had no idea what casting director was there. You had no idea who was looking for somebody to put in a new movie or where. You had no idea. So there was a different sense of why we're here, you know. And back in New York, in our very early years, everybody was just like, I just want to get on stage and be the best comedian I can be. But then after enough time in the business, it starts to be, I want to be the best comedian I can be and still get opportunities and still get the opportunities that I feel like I'm owed or that are out there everywhere. Why aren't they coming to me? It just eats away at, you know, the psyche.
You know, I remember, you know, Barry Martin, my roommate, you know, Barry, and I'd love to hear a story about him. But we used to have these round tables in my living room. I'd have one of these L-shaped couches, and everybody had the legal pads out, and everybody was we were all helping each other. Not me, I wasn't a performer, but they were all together helping each other. It felt like it was very teamy out
Yeah.
there.
Yeah, I think that's just a function of, you know, everybody being at the same level in the business, you know. But also, you could sell a pilot out of nowhere. I mean, you could actually come up with a good pilot idea, and if you had any sort of, if they were like, you know, hey, this Jay Leno guy is hot, and Jay Leno wrote a pilot, they would really look at it and go, yeah, let's do this show with Jay Leno. You know, now it's like it's a whole different thing. But back then, there actually still was the possibility to write your own, you know, sitcom and sell it, or write a really funny comedy show and have, you know, maybe a syndicator be interested in it, you know. And that was happening to a certain degree for some people. But that actually drove a pilot that I worked on with Barry Martyr, your former roommate. It was myself and Barry and two other comedy writers, and we would get together for these sessions, and it was kind of a new form of sketch comedy. The idea was, it was just it was called Click, and just the idea was, we're clicking through the channels, seeing what's on, right? And it's all this stuff that would obviously never really be TV shows. So really short form sketch kind of stuff really lent itself. And of course, that Barry Marty, you could see how he would be perfect in that. But I remember sitting there with Barry, and I was the only stand-up. The other two were not really stand-ups. One of them was kind of sort of trying to do stand-up, but they were basically writers. And Barry hated him. And he would just lean over to me in the middle of writing sessions, and he would go, this guy smells like a candle. I want to light his, I want to put his head on fire. He smells like a candle. Or just when one of them would be talking, making a serious point about what we should do next, Barry would just go, suck my banana. Hilarious. You go, I got a new invention, pizza in a sock. What do you think? I think it could sell. This would be going on in my ear in the middle of a writing session because Barry couldn't stand the other guys.
Oh boy, I tell you, you nailed him, man. You nailed him. That was him.
He makes me laugh. Yeah, and there were a lot of things like that. Like I did a pilot with Robert Schimmel. You know, Robert Schimmel was making his bones at the time, but he had a couple of fans. He had one particular fan who had a lot of money, and he was like, yeah, I'm going to finance a pilot for you. And he was a real rough kind of New Jersey type guy, and he owned a liquidation business. You know, auctioning off things that, you know, he had bought from companies going out of business, office supplies and typewriters and things. And he had a lot of money, and he said, sure, I'll finance a pilot for you. And so Robert Schimmel and myself wrote most of this pilot. Jeff Martyr was on it. I can't remember all the other people involved, but there were much. I think Jeff Gerbino was on it. And it was this weird little sketch pilot. And we shot the thing, and there were some funny parts of it for sure. And at one point, Schimmel was like, I'm going to try and sell this thing. You know, it's right now, it's sitting in this other guy's warehouse. Just the master tapes are just sitting there. I'm going to try and sell this thing. So he goes to try and get the tapes back. And the guy's wife answers and goes, yeah, he's not here anymore. Don't call back. He said, I don't know where he is. I don't know what happened to him. He's gone. Don't call back. Just leave it alone. And apparently he disappeared because his money was ill-gotten, shall we say.
Oh my God.
Apparently he was all mobbed up, and so this pilot I did with Schimmel was like sitting on the, in a box on the closet floor somewhere. But
You
there
know,
was a lot of crazy stuff happen.
crazy. I mean, show business can be the greatest, leave you with the greatest feelings in the world. And listening to your story, you're in the middle of it in so many different ways, so close.
So close, yeah, yeah, yeah. I had a lot of shots at bat, and for whatever reason, my shit just didn't get traction, and so I just keep doing what we do. You know.
Tell me about the last 5 years for you. It's so interesting to hear. Forget about last year. So interesting to hear that the Comedy Store is now still its prime prime location now again.
Yeah.
Tell me what it's like the last 5 years for you, other than last.
Well, Well, I was about 15 years ago, maybe 16, 17 years ago. I was feeling really antsy. I was feeling like I wanted to create. But I also, at one point, I went through a 2 or 3 year period of pathological stage fright, and I took some time off from stand up. But in the interim, I did a play. I did, Steve Martin's play in New York. I did a couple of indie movies. I did a few things. I mean, I did a bunch of acting work, and I did some directing of some theater, and I did a lot of stuff. But I wasn't doing stand up. And then after a few years of that, I was just like, I want to get back into stand up. I feel like I'm ready to get back into stand up now. And then I had pathological stage fright for a few years, and breaking it was really, really hard, really, really hard. And an opportunity came up through a couple of friends of mine I know that had been working in England, and the comedy scene in England had really exploded, and it was interesting and juicy, and I saw a lot of stuff going on. So I was like, can you hook me up? Can I start working over there? So he hooked me up with an agent over there who just did gigs, and a lot of them were low money gigs, like you'd make maybe 75 pounds for one night in somewhere in the boonies in England, and you have to take train up there, and all this sort of stuff. So I wasn't making a lot of money, but I had a friend who had a friend who lived in London who let me stay at her place, and I used that as my home base, and I would go over and do more and more of these gigs. And eventually I started to get involved with the Edinburgh Fringe Festival, and kind of made a reputation for myself, and I was doing okay. But what I loved about it was nobody knew anything about my resume or anything. And in fact, it wasn't after I had made friends with some people a couple of years later, people were like, yeah, what's the deal, man? You're like the first American who's come over here and never said a word about what they've already accomplished. And that only kind of increased their respect for me, because I was never like, well, I've done pilots and I worked with this star and that star and all this sort of shit. Because Americans would go over there and they'd ask for these long intros. He was on the Tonight Show. He was on Evening at the Improv. He did this. He did that. They don't do over there in England. They don't care what your credits are. They would just say, now here's Bruce Starr. And you were either funny or you weren't. And I never did any of that stuff about credits or anything. And people would ask me, where you from? What do you do? And I would never tell them my whole background and everything. And when they learned about it, it was cool. So I was able to have the experience of nobody knowing who I am, not having any, standards to uphold, or not being able to disappoint anybody. It gave me a real sense of freedom. And it was the first time that I felt closer to when I first started doing comedy, which was I just want to do any gig and get up there and be good. I didn't care about who was in the audience, what my career was doing, how much money am I going to make. I didn't care about any of that. I just wanted to feel that pure love of getting up and not knowing. Is that was the other thing, is over there, there's some cultural differences and some things, and I was a fish out of water because it's not my country, and that kind of put me in a great place to be just about discovering again. And I fell in love with working internationally. I mean, out of the UK. Comedy went around the world out of the UK as a base, because it's very difficult for foreign comics to come and work in America. but it was real easy for American comics to go and work elsewhere. And they were booking gigs. I mean, I did a tour through China. I did tours through the Middle East. We
Wow.
did opening clubs in Hong Kong, and they opened a club in Abu Dhabi. You know, all these places where there were a lot of English-speaking expats. And the ease of movement from the UK to everywhere else in the world was great.
Wow.
And so I ended up working all around the world and working with, and the way they do a show is very different too. Here we had evolved to the place where you have your opening act, who's your MC, who was generally, let's say, working a club on the road, right? The MC was generally the comic with the least experience, and they would get up and they would do 15 minutes, do 5 minutes of promotion for the next upcoming events, and then bring on the feature act, who would do 30 minutes, make a reasonable amount of money, and then a headliner would go up, and it would really be the headliner's show. They go up from 45 minutes to an hour, right? Over there, they would do 4 comics, 15 to 20 minutes each. The last comic maybe would get an extra 20 pounds and do an extra 5 minutes. But basically, it was 4 comics. There were no rankings. So in America, when you were doing comedy on the road, you were the person who knew the most of anybody on the show wherever you went, because it was always 2 more inexperienced people on ahead of you.
Right.
In the UK, 4 performers on a show, each of them a headliner.
I like that.
Yeah, so you were running with thoroughbreds, you know? And I worked with some comics who changed my life just by watching them and talking with them about comedy and what their perspectives are. They had a different artful approach to it and all that sort of stuff. It was tremendous, and it raised my game. And I was working all the time in Amsterdam. I remember headlining my own shows in Paris. It was crazy because there were English-speaking expats all over the world. I got booked to this gig in Hong Kong, and it was amazing. It was this jazz club that seated maybe 150 people, right?
Perfect.
But if you show up in Hong Kong and you're doing this gig, you go on the 2 English-speaking radio stations that cater to English-speaking expats.
I like that.
And that's Americans, Canadians, Australians, New Zealanders, right? And you do those 2 radio shows, and you're packed for the whole time you're there. And it was phenomenal. It was phenomenal. So I loved working on the foreign circuit and traveling all around the world and meeting new comics, and then meeting local comics in these places, you know, meeting the guys who were the ones who began the comedy scene in India, you know, and I'm working with them in Melbourne, Australia, you know, and meeting these comics from South Africa who were talking about, you know, pop culture that they watched when they were kids. And it's like the A-Team. I'm like, whoa, man, it shrunk the world so much.
Wow.
And just felt like, wow, we really are the same. And the beauty of it is, this gets real patriotic. Stand-up comedy is a uniquely American art form. And everybody who started doing stand-up comedy after the 1980s, anywhere in the world, learned about it from watching Americans.
Yep.
And then they take it, you know, and they've done their own variations on the theme, and they've, you know, grown it their own way. But it's because of American stand-up comedy that stand-up comedy is hot all over the world right now. And America should be proud, is at least as proud of stand-up comedy as they are of jazz, because it is equally as an American an art form as that.
Absolutely. And you know, you said something perfectly. Why see someone who opens up a show and who curses, who's not that funny, and he sets a bad precedent, you know, and then by the time you get to the middle act, okay, but the whole show should be great from start to finish. I like
Yeah. Yeah. Well, you know, that was the economics of working the road in those days. You know, club owners would pay, you know, anywhere from 5,000 to 10,000 a week, depending on the size of the venue and your draw, you know, to headline a room. I mean, you wouldn't start at that, but if you did as much TV as I did, you know, they'd give you $5,000 to do 4 nights, 6 shows, you know, and so they had to spend less money on other performers. Having said that, though, it opened the door for a lot of local performers in a lot of local markets, you know, and it helped comics like, you know, I'm involved with this new series on Sirius XM called OCD, Obsessive Comedy Disorder. It's a 4-part, 3-part 3-part, 2 halves. It's actually 6 episodes, for 3 episodes and 6 parts of a history of the 80s comedy boom. It's ostensibly created and produced by and starring Dan Pasternak, a very funny comedian who also happened to have a life as a network executive, and he's an absolute beast of comedy. I mean, he is the guy. He's my go-to guy about anything I want to know. He has taught me more about comedy than any other single individual I've ever known. And we have this real sort of like nerd connection with the comedy and the history of comedy, and we love working together. And so he put together this thing, and he brought me in to work on it with him. And it's fantastic. It's the first episode is about how all the comedians who became the big names of the comedy boom era, what got them involved, who they admired. It's called Even Your Heroes Have Heroes. And then the second episode, 2 parts, was about how the comedy scene developed in New York, and then how the comedy scene developed in Los Angeles. And then the third part is about how the strike, the Comedy Store strike, changed everything and created a whole different business model and determined how the rest of the boom played out to when it finally kind of petered out. So it's a fascinating thing. I highly recommend everybody check it out. It's called OCD Boomers, the history of comedy in the 80s. And it's really interesting, and a lot of people are involved. Like there's interviews. We did interviews with everybody from Marshall Warfield and Jay Leno to Gilbert Gottfried and the Funny Boys and Paula Poundstone and Judy Tenuta and Tom Dreesen and all the people who were kind of like, the boomers who were really making their mark, telling the stories about this time of life that you're celebrating as well.
Wow.
So
and the last thing is the green room. Tell me about the green room.
Yeah, the green room. Many years ago in the late '80s, mid to late '80s, I had one of the first shows on what is now Comedy Central. At the time, Comedy Central was Ha. It was called Ha, the Ha channel, HA exclamation point. And so what happened in the late '80s was the business started to get a sense of, comedy's really a thing. And 2 competing networks, all comedy, were created. HBO's Comedy Channel, which kind of had an MTV model of doing things. It was clips from movies or stand-up shows or whatever with, VJs. And then this other channel, Ha, which was more like a half-hour programming kind of a thing. And plus, also acquisitions. They would play the old Mayor Tyler Moore shows and all the great classic comedies, but all the new programming was more formal than the HBO Comedy Channel. But they both quickly realized that they were cannibalizing themselves and their own audiences and their own talent. So they merged and became Comedy Central. When it was still Ha, I got a deal to do one of their first talk shows, and it was called Comics Only. And when you look at, there are some clips online. There's little clips of some of the people who were on the show, but I mean, we had everybody from, I think it was one of Ellen DeGeneres' first appearances, and we had Emo Phillips and Stephen Wright and Sam Kinison and Jeff Foxworthy and a whole bunch of people that you were friends with who maybe didn't, get bigger names. But I would also bring on there, like our Larry Bud Melman, as we called him, was Rip Taylor, and Steve Allen used to come and do the show all the time. Wow. And the premise of it was like, we always loved watching the comedians on the Tonight Show. So we said, well, what if there was a Tonight Show kind of a format, and it was only comedians, no musicians, no actors, nobody plugging books. And so that was the premise of it, was just comics coming on doing panel. And I would open the show pretending to be a regular talk show, and I would attempt to do a monologue, but the idea was that nobody ever gets to do a monologue. So the monologues would always go awry in some way. So you never saw stand-up. You only saw comics sitting, and some people chose to do their stand-up in conversation form, but it was really prepared. Other people, I would give the comics a choice. I'd say, you want to just wing this, or do you want to do prepared material? Or, give me a few things that I can hit that I know are going to work for you, that you feel comfortable, and we can wing the rest, And so Most people chose to come on and do a version of their acts in conversation form, but not everybody. But so there are pluses and minuses to this concept. But Steve Allen would come on. I remember there was one sketch where I would be trying to do a monologue and keep screwing it up, and I'd go, I'll be right back. And I go backstage and I'd smash this glass that says, "In case of comedy emergency, break glass." And I'd break the glass, and Steve Allen would come out and do a monologue. Finish the monologue for me in some way. It was always, so Steve Allen did it a bunch of times. We had Phyllis Diller on the show. I had Pat Cooper on the show. I was really mixing old school and younger comics, and so many. Jon Stewart was on the show. Jon Stewart and Judy Gold are in the opening credits. Kinnison and Belzer was on. I mean, it just, you name it. I mean, it was really a time capsule of the 80s working comics, plus some other folks. The show with Phyllis Diller is just breathtaking to me. And the impulse of that was, it came from, I wished that I could share in some way with an audience what was so profound to me about becoming part of the comedy world. It really is a different way of being in the universe. It really is a different lifestyle, not just the external lifestyle, but really just a different way of looking at the world. It's like meeting other goths or something, people who they get you, and I always, the comics only was an attempt to try and encapsulate that, like by talking to comics rather than having them do stand up. The effort that I intended was to try and get a feeling of that. Oh, hanging out with comics is fun, and it's a little different than hanging out with normal people. I don't believe that I really succeeded in that on Comics Only. I mean, it has its virtues in a lot of the ways. Fred Wolf was the genius on it. He was my Ed McMahon, and one of the most hilarious people on earth. We did a lot of crazy sketches. We did really out there, edgy stuff. People blowing their brains out all the time, and really dark stuff, but all with this kind of light vibe. But so I didn't really succeed at accomplishing what was really the organic core of the idea, which was hanging out with comics is a little bit different. And if you could experience it, you would probably dig it and get that this is something different.
Yeah.
So I always had that in the back of my head and in my heart, that someday I want to try and do that. I gave it one shot. I was too naive. I didn't have enough. The show wasn't the right thing, but I always had this thing I wanted to do. And then one year at the Edinburgh Fringe Festival, someone would offer me a time slot and said, do whatever you want to do. So I started doing this show that I called The Green Room. And I would tell the audience, you're not supposed to be here, but we're going to let you hang out. So, and it was a late night show, started at about midnight or 11:30. And I would bring on all these comics who were doing shows around Edinburgh, and they literally would get together and talk about the shows they just did.
Wow.
And I would just talk to them. I would get to know them, and I would, and our live audience was loving it. Wow. And I brought a couple of cameras into the place, and I started to just shoot it from different places in the room, just to see what it would look like if I were to make a TV show out of this thing, right? And then by experimenting in those ways, I also realized there's a way to produce comedy that feels a little bit different. So I tried a lot of different things. Because one of the things that always frustrated me about watching comedy on television was that you always had to adapt. Comedy always had to adapt to the medium of television production. Right. Hit your mark here. This is a 2-shot, an ISO, a 2-shot, all that stuff. We had to be in the right place for the cameras to find you and everything. And I was like, well, there must be a different way to do this that feels more energetic, that feels more spontaneous, that feels like, why can't the production of TV adapt to the greatest things about comedy, which are the spontaneity and the surprise and the unexpected things and all that sort of stuff. So we were doing the show live, and I was running camera in a lot of different ways, experimenting with different things, and then put together a sizzle reel for a show, for The Green Room, where the premise, when I went in to pitch it to Showtime, and Showtime at the time wanted to get back into the stand-up business. In the early 80s, the early cable boom, HBO and Showtime were both like, if you get an HBO special, you get a Showtime special, one or the other, But then HBO started to really take off and leave Showtime in the dust. and Showtime couldn't really compete with the fact that HBO was getting George Carlin and Bill Cosby and all these big names.
Who was in charge of HBO?
Chris Albrecht. Yeah. Chris Albrecht, who I met when he was running the New York Improv, who used to tell me to cool my jet. But anyway, so so HBO had left Showtime in the dust. But then HBO started to really not move forward in stand-up. They all their stand-ups were big names. You know, it'd be Chris Rock, Jerry Seinfeld, George Carlin. They kind of let go of that developing new comedy talent thing. And Showtime looked at the landscape and thought, well, maybe this is our time to get back into it. And so when I went in with the Green Room, and their thing at the time was No Limits, because they were going to be really edgy, and I went in with the Green Room as, this is comics really talking unfiltered, and, blah, blah, blah. And I had a sizzle reel with a lot of really decent people on it, because there were a lot of Americans that had gone over there that I could use in the sizzle reel. And even Matt Stone and Trey Parker were over there for the TV festival, and they came and they did the show, which was like crazy. Like, people couldn't believe they can get in a room with 99 people and Matt and Trey. So we had a great sizzle reel, and it was shot in a really sort of spontaneous kind of underground way. And they bought it, and they said, let's do it. And when we did the show, again, I didn't want to do it in a studio. I didn't want to do it with a studio audience. I wanted it to be in an environment of some kind. So we just got a big giant dance club and built a little environment in it. We hired the camera people. We told them, this is not a studio shoot. You got to shoot this like news or sports. We don't know where the funny's coming from. Get it. It's up to you. And I knew that it would have that spontaneous movement to the cameras and things. And I put it in a circle so that I never had to cut the audience. You could see the audience in every shot. I wanted it to really feel like you, the viewer, were in this room or in this circle of comics, really, really close and tight. And I'm pretty proud of how the 2 seasons we did worked out. I wish I had gone on more, but I did continue to do them live a bunch of times. I did a bunch of times at Melbourne Comedy Festival, and at Just for Laughs in Montreal, and a couple of festivals around the country. And I was really digging doing that. But I kind of stopped doing that because I always kept feeling like, God damn it, if we were running cameras, I would feel so much better. I was always depressed after a show, going, I can't believe this amazing stuff has just gone into the ether again, But it was fun doing that show. And so that was a culmination of that organic thing that started in the early 80s or the mid 80s, about I wanted an audience to experience what I experienced when I stood in the bar at the Improv, listening to John DeBellis and Larry David and Gilbert Gottfried and Jerry Seinfeld and Franken and Davis and Elaine Boozler and Emily Levine, the ones who were already established at the Improv. I just saw them hanging out, laughing, making each other laugh, talking about politics, talking about sports, talking about whatever. How I just realized that was an incredible experience. And I also found that comics talking amongst themselves are often so intelligent, and they're fearless. They'll say whatever they believe. And if it becomes an issue, somebody's going to make it funny at some point. So it's okay. And that's what I try to do in the Green Room.
Wow. What a bunch of accomplishments, man. I mean,
well, you're very kind. Unfortunately, they're not making any money.
Well, people are gonna learn that you could be super successful, you could be accomplished, you could be super talented, and there's still more to it. There's still final steps there. And listen, I treasure you. I always have, and I really appreciate you doing the show and sharing yourself and sharing about you. I really appreciate it, Paul.
Oh, it's my pleasure. It's fun to talk about that stuff. I don't really like to talk about myself that much because I always feel like, oh my God, what am I doing tomorrow is the most important thing, But I do feel like you're contextualizing things. Like that was a period of time, the 80s and each of our respective journeys through comedy are something that I'm glad you're documenting. I'm glad you put it out there, because years from now, here's the thing that drives everything that I'm doing right now. Everything from the moment I started work on The Aristocrats, which was, I started work on it in, I think, 2001.
Yeah, we didn't even talk about that. People wanted me to ask you about that, but we can go on forever. Go ahead.
Okay, so I started working on it with Penn in about 2001, and it was released in 2005.
Wow.
But from that phase of my life through now, every single project that I've been working on has been done from me at the age of 14. I look at everything and I go, when I was 14 years old, if I had stumbled across this, how would I feel? And I feel good about that. I feel like that's what the green room, I feel like I can look at that. When I was 14 or 15 and I was all things comedy, and I was like, this show would have blown my mind. And that makes me happy. You know, the Aristocrats would have blown my mind. The Book Satiristas would have blown my mind. You know, some of the stuff I'm working on now, it's all for me at the age of 14. And that's what you're doing. If I were 14 and I came across this series, it would change my life. And so thanks for doing that. And I'm really honored to be a part of it. Thank you. George Carlin once said to me, he said, I asked him if he thought his work changed anybody. You know, did it change anybody's politics? Do you think it matters what you say on stage, that actually makes a difference in people's lives other than just the enjoyment of it in the moment or whatever? And he said, I know it does. He goes, because people tell it to me all the time. He goes, I have people tell me all the time that a joke that I did or a show that they saw changed them in some way. He goes, I have no intention of how it changes them, but it did. And he said, that's the thing. He said, when you put out art, when you put out comedy, he goes, you're changing the world more than as many donations as you can make to help people in Darfur or Yemen. He goes, you're changing more by influencing somebody artistically and creatively that's going to change their lives. And that's how you change the world. And I thought that was a fascinating thing, especially to hear from somebody like George Carlin.
And that's why I'm doing the show, because I hope in some way, whether it be months from now or years from now or decades from now, people are going to hear your story. They're going to hear Tom Dreesen's story, and it's going to be invaluable. So, my friend, God bless. I hope that we stay in contact, stay together in some way, shape, or form. And thank you so much for doing this show.
Thanks for having me, man. And I'm honored to be among your guests.
Oh, you're the best, man. You are the best. Thank you, everybody. Thanks for watching the 80s Golden Age of Comedy. Mr. Paul Provenza. Doesn't get any better than this. Bye-bye, everybody.